Continuing with the real estate purchase contract, number 8, buyer's condition of purchase. 8.1, due diligence condition. Buyer's obligation to purchase the property. Mark 1, is or is not conditioned upon buyer's due diligence as defined in this section 8.1a below. This condition is referred to as the due diligence condition. If checked in the affirmative, sections 8.1a through 8.1c apply. Otherwise, they do not. A. Due diligence items. Buyer's due diligence shall consist of buyer's review and approval of the contents of the seller disclosures referenced in Section 7 and any other tests, evaluations, and verifications of the property deemed necessary or appropriate by buyer, such as the physical condition of the property, the existence of any hazardous substances, environmental issues or geologic conditions, the square footage or acreage of the land and or improvements, the condition of the roof, walls, and foundation, the condition of the plumbing, electrical, mechanical, heating, and air conditioning systems and fixtures, the condition of all appliances, the costs and availability of homeowners insurance and flood insurance, if applicable, water source availability and quality, the location of property lines, regulatory use restrictions or violations, fees for services such as HOA dues, municipal services and utility costs, convicted sex offenders residing in proximity to the property, and any other matters deemed material to buyer in making a decision to purchase the property, unless otherwise provided in the REPC. All of buyer's due diligence shall be paid for by buyer and shall be conducted by individuals or entities of buyer's choice. Seller agrees to cooperate with buyer's due diligence. Buyer agrees to pay for any damage to the property resulting from any such inspections or tests during the due diligence. B. Buyer's right to cancel or resolve objections. If buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion that the results of the due diligence are unacceptable, buyer may either I. No later than the due diligence deadline referenced in Section 24B, cancel the REPC by providing written notice to seller, whereupon the earnest money deposit shall be released to buyer without the requirement of further written authorization from seller, or 2. No later than the due diligence deadline referenced in Section 24B, resolve in writing with seller any objections buyer has arising from buyer's due diligence. C. Failure to cancel or resolve objections. If buyer fails to cancel the REPC or fails to resolve in writing with seller any objections buyer has arising from buyer's due diligence, as provided in Section 8.1b, buyer shall be deemed to have waived the due diligence condition and accept as provided in Sections 8.2a and 8.3b1, the earnest money deposit shall become non-refundable. Hopefully that's understandable. Very important to know. Don't need a reason. If the due diligence deadline is not passed, just You can just say you don't want it or resolve any issues. 8.2 Appraisal Condition. Buyer's obligation to purchase the property, and mark 1, is or is not conditioned upon the property appraising for not less than the purchase price. This condition is referred to as the appraisal condition. If checked in the affirmative, sections 8.2a and 8.2b apply, otherwise they do not. A. Buyer's right to cancel. If after completion of an appraisal by a licensed appraiser, buyer receives written notice from the lender or the appraiser that the property has appraised for less than the purchase price, known as a notice of appraised value, buyer may cancel the REPC by providing written notice to seller with a copy of the notice of appraised value no later than the financing and appraisal deadline referenced in Section 24C, whereupon the earnest money deposit shall be released to buyer without the requirement of further written authorization from seller. B. Failure to cancel. If the REPC is not canceled as provided in this section 8.2, buyer shall be deemed to have waived the appraisal condition and accept as provided in sections 8.1b and 8.3b1, the earnest money deposit shall become non-refundable. 8.3 Financing condition. Check applicable box. A. No financing is required. Buyer's obligation to purchase the property is not conditioned upon buyer obtaining financing. If checked, section 8.3b below does not apply. B. Financing required. Buyer's obligation to purchase the property is conditioned upon buyer obtaining the loan referenced in section 2.1c. This condition is referred to as the financing condition. If checked, sections 8.3b1, 2, and 3 apply. Otherwise, they do not. If the REPC is not canceled by buyer as provided in sections 8.1b or 8.2a, then buyer agrees to work diligently and in good faith to obtain the loan. 1. Buyer's right to cancel before the financing and appraisal deadline. If buyer, in buyer's sole discretion, is not satisfied with the terms and conditions of the loan, buyer may, after the due diligence deadline referenced in section 24b, if applicable, cancel the REPC by providing written notice to seller no later than the financing and appraisal deadline referenced in section 24c, whereupon, put a dollar amount, of buyer's earnest money deposit shall be released to seller without the requirement of further written authorization from buyer, and the remainder of the buyer's earnest money deposit shall be released to buyer without further written authorization from the seller. Probably put a 0 down there, unless you have other negotiation agreements with the seller. 8.3b2 Buyer's right to cancel after the financing and appraisal deadline. If after expiration of the financing and appraisal deadline referenced in section 24c, buyer fails to obtain the loan, meaning that the proceeds of the loan have not been delivered by the lender to the escrow closing office as required under section 3.2, then buyer shall not be obligated to purchase the property, and buyer or seller may cancel the REPC by providing written notice to the other party. 8.3b, number 3. Earnest money deposit released to seller. If the REPC is canceled as provided in section 8.3b2, buyer agrees that all of buyer's earnest money deposit, or deposits if applicable, see Section 8.4 below, shall be released to seller without the requirement of further written authorization from buyer. Seller agrees to accept as seller's exclusive remedy the earnest money deposit or deposits, if applicable, as liquidated damages. Buyer and seller agree that liquidated damages would be difficult and impractical to calculate, and the earnest money deposit or deposits, if applicable, is a fair and reasonable estimate of seller's damages in the event buyer fails to obtain the loan. 8.4 Additional earnest money deposit. If the REPC has not been previously canceled by buyer as provided in sections 8.1, 8.2, or 8.3 as applicable, then no later than the due diligence deadline or the financing and appraisal deadline, whichever is latter, buyer, check 1, will or will not, deliver to the buyer's brokerage an additional earnest money deposit in the amount of, put in amount, the earnest money deposit and the additional earnest money deposit, if applicable, are sometimes referred to herein as the deposits. The earnest money deposit or deposits, if applicable, shall be credited toward the purchase price at closing. And why would they put more money in? Well, just to make a more enticing offer. After buyer's due diligence, everything looks good. Throwing in a little extra money to say you're serious can sometimes help a deal. That's all.